Right now, organized armed conflict between different human groups feels like such a persistent, seemingly inevitable feature of human history that it's worth asking a truly fundamental question. When did humans actually first start engaging in organized warfare? And does the archaeological evidence actually support the common assumption that humans have always fought organized wars against each other throughout our entire evolutionary history? Let's dig into this properly, because the answer involves some seriously fascinating archaeological detective work alongside an actively debated scientific question researchers continue investigating and discussing. Let's start with an important distinction worth establishing clearly up front because it shapes how to properly think about this entire topic. Researchers generally distinguish between individual interpersonal violence, which almost certainly occurred throughout virtually all of human evolutionary history, given how commonly it appears across numerous primate species more broadly, and organized warfare specifically, involving coordinated, sustained conflict between distinct social groups. This distinction matters considerably, since answering when humans specifically began organized warfare requires looking for evidence of this particular, more specific and more socially coordinated form of violence, rather than simply any evidence of individual violent conflict, which represents a somewhat different, though certainly related, category worth examining separately. Let's talk about the earliest confirmed archaeological evidence for organized warfare, because this represents an important, carefully researched starting point worth exploring specifically. One of the most extensively studied, earliest confirmed examples of organized group violence comes from a site in Kenya, showing evidence of a group of individuals who appear to have died together during a single violent event, with skeletal evidence suggesting coordinated attack rather than simply isolated, unconnected individual violence. This particular site dates back roughly 10,000 years, representing one of the earliest well-documented pieces of direct archaeological evidence for something resembling organized group conflict, though researchers continue actively debating exactly how representative this specific site actually proves to be regarding broader patterns of early human violence during this particular historical period. Let's talk about why researchers faced genuine difficulty definitively confirming organized warfare's actual origin point too, because this represents an important methodological challenge worth exploring in additional depth. Distinguishing between organized warfare specifically and other forms of violence, including individual conflict, ritual violence, or even accidental mass casualty events based purely on skeletal remains and associated archaeological evidence, presents genuine interpretive challenges, since ancient skeletal evidence alone doesn't always provide sufficiently clear, unambiguous confirmation regarding the specific social context and organization actually surrounding a given documented instance of ancient violence. Let's talk about the broader scientific debate regarding whether warfare specifically connects to the development of settled agriculture and increasing social complexity too, because this represents a particularly significant, actively researched theoretical question worth exploring specifically. Some researchers propose that organized warfare specifically developed alongside, and partly in direct response to, the emergence of settled agricultural societies already explored extensively in other discussions regarding early human agricultural development. Since settled populations with accumulated stored food resources and defined territorial boundaries created new specific incentives and circumstances favoring organized conflict, compared to the more mobile, less territorially fixed hunter-gatherer lifestyle that characterized most of earlier human history. This particular theoretical perspective suggests organized warfare, rather than representing some kind of fixed, unchanging feature of human nature extending back through our entire evolutionary history, may actually represent a more specific historical and social development, connected directly to particular changes in human social organization and resource accumulation patterns that emerged relatively recently in our species' overall evolutionary history, considerably more recently than many people probably casually assume. Let's talk about counter-evidence and competing perspectives regarding this specific theoretical framework too, because it's worth presenting this ongoing scientific debate honestly, rather than favoring one single perspective as though it represented a fully settled, universally agreed upon scientific conclusion. Other researchers point to evidence suggesting at least some forms of organized intergroup violence likely occurred among earlier hunter-gatherer populations as well, predating settled agriculture, drawing on comparative evidence from various documented hunter-gatherer societies that anthropologists have directly studied and observed, some of which show evidence of organized intergroup conflict despite maintaining a considerably more mobile, less agriculturally settled lifestyle. Let's talk about chimpanzee intergroup violence as a relevant comparative consideration too, because this represents an interesting, closely related dimension worth exploring specifically, given how directly it connects to broader evolutionary questions regarding our species' closest living primate relatives. Researchers studying wild chimpanzee populations have documented organized, sometimes lethal intergroup conflict between different chimpanzee communities, suggesting the underlying behavioral and cognitive capacity for organized intergroup violence likely has really deep evolutionary roots, potentially predating the emergence of modern humans specifically, and extending back into our broader shared evolutionary lineage with other closely related primate species. This detail is worth including because it adds important additional nuance to the broader debate already discussed extensively throughout this topic, suggesting the underlying capacity for organized intergroup violence likely represents a considerably older evolutionary inheritance. Even while the specific scale, frequency, and particular social organization of documented human warfare likely did change considerably alongside the broader social and economic transformations already discussed extensively throughout this topic, including the emergence of settled agriculture and increasingly complex social and political organization. Let's talk about the Jebel Sahaba site specifically in additional detail too, because this represents another particularly significant, extensively studied piece of early evidence worth exploring in considerable depth. This site, located along the Nile in what's now Sudan, contains skeletal remains showing evidence of violent injury dating back roughly 13,000 years, with numerous individuals showing embedded projectile points and other injury patterns consistent with sustained, repeated violent conflict rather than a single isolated incident. Researchers studying this particular site have proposed it may represent evidence of sustained conflict between different groups competing for limited resources during a period of significant regional environmental stress and change, offering a particularly compelling, well-documented example directly relevant to the broader theoretical debate already discussed extensively throughout this topic regarding what specific circumstances might have historically driven organized intergroup conflict. Let's talk about defensive fortification archaeological evidence too, because this represents another important, closely related category of evidence worth exploring specifically, offering indirect but valuable additional insight into ancient warfare's historical development. Researchers studying ancient settlement sites have identified increasingly elaborate defensive structures, including walls, ditches, and strategically positioned settlements, developing alongside increasingly settled, complex human societies, suggesting that whatever the precise origin point of organized warfare specifically, the perceived threat of intergroup conflict clearly became significant enough within certain specific historical periods and regions to motivate substantial, deliberate defensive infrastructure investment. This detail is worth including because it provides an additional, complementary category of evidence beyond simply skeletal remains alone, helping researchers construct a more complete picture of how seriously and how consistently ancient societies actually needed to consider organized conflict as a genuine, ongoing, practical concern requiring dedicated defensive preparation and investment. Let's talk about how weapon technology development specifically connects to this broader historical question too, because this represents an interesting, closely related dimension worth exploring in additional depth. Researchers studying the development of specifically weapons-focused technology, as opposed to tools primarily designed for hunting or other everyday practical purposes, have found evidence suggesting increasingly specialized weapon development occurring alongside the broader emergence of settled agricultural societies and increasing social complexity already discussed extensively throughout this topic, potentially offering additional supporting evidence for the theoretical perspective connecting organized warfare's increasing scale and sophistication directly to these broader social and economic transformations occurring during this same general historical period. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about resource scarcity and environmental stress as potential drivers of ancient organized conflict, too, because this represents an important, closely related theoretical consideration worth exploring specifically before continuing this broader discussion. Several researchers studying ancient conflict evidence have proposed that periods of significant environmental stress, including documented ancient climate shifts and resulting resource scarcity, already explored extensively in other discussions regarding Earth's historical climate variability, may have played a significant role in triggering or intensifying organized intergroup conflict during specific historical periods. Since increased competition over increasingly scarce essential resources like water, arable land, or reliable food sources would have created genuine, practical incentive toward organized conflict between different competing groups. Let's talk about how anthropologists studying contemporary and recently studied traditional societies have contributed valuable comparative evidence too, because this represents an important, complementary research approach worth exploring in additional depth. Beyond purely archaeological evidence already discussed extensively throughout this topic, anthropologists directly observing and documenting various traditional societies, some maintaining lifestyles reasonably comparable to different periods of early human history, have documented considerable variation in how frequently and how intensely different specific societies actually engage in organized intergroup conflict, suggesting this behavior isn't simply a fixed, inevitable feature of human social organization, but rather varies considerably depending on specific environmental, economic, and cultural circumstances particular to each specific society and historical period being examined. Let's talk about the specific role territorial boundaries and property concepts likely played in this broader historical development too, because this represents an important, closely related consideration worth exploring before wrapping up this broader discussion, connecting directly to broader questions already explored extensively in other discussions regarding how agriculture influenced evolving concepts of land ownership and property. As human societies developed increasingly fixed territorial boundaries and formalized property concepts, particularly connected to settled agricultural land already discussed extensively throughout this topic. This development likely created new specific circumstances and incentives potentially favoring organized conflict over these particular territorial boundaries and resource claims, compared to the more flexible, less rigidly defined territorial concepts that likely characterized earlier, more mobile hunter-gatherer societies throughout much of earlier human history. Let's talk about how researchers continue actively debating the specific relative importance of these various different proposed contributing factors too, because it's worth acknowledging honestly, before wrapping up this discussion, that researchers don't currently share complete unanimous agreement regarding precisely how to weigh and prioritize these various different theoretical explanations already discussed extensively throughout this topic. Some researchers emphasize agricultural settlement and resource accumulation as the primary driving factor. Others emphasize deeper evolutionary behavioral tendencies already present before agriculture's development. And still others propose a more complex, interconnected combination of multiple different contributing factors working together, representing a seriously active, ongoing area of scholarly research and discussion, rather than a fully settled, universally agreed upon scientific consensus. Let's talk about how researchers actually distinguish genuine warfare evidence from other explanations for ancient violent injury too, because this represents an important methodological consideration worth addressing directly. Researchers examining ancient skeletal remains showing evidence of violent injury look for specific patterns, including multiple individuals showing similar injury patterns consistent with a single coordinated event, evidence regarding the specific type of weapon involved, and broader archaeological context, including settlement patterns, and any additional evidence suggesting organized group conflict, allowing researchers to build a more confident case for genuine organized warfare specifically, as opposed to isolated individual violence or other alternative explanations for the specific documented ancient injury evidence. Let's talk about specific forensic techniques researchers use to distinguish weapon-caused injury from other causes of ancient skeletal trauma too, because this represents an important, technically detailed methodological consideration worth exploring in additional depth before continuing this broader discussion. Researchers examining ancient skeletal remains carefully analyze the specific characteristics of bone trauma, including fracture patterns, embedded projectile fragments, and specific wound hand placement and angle, allowing trained forensic archaeologists to distinguish weapon-caused violent injury from other potential causes of skeletal trauma, including accidental injury, animal predation, or natural post-mortem bone damage occurring after burial, ensuring that researchers' conclusions regarding ancient violence and potential organized conflict rest on truly solid, carefully verified physical evidence rather than more ambiguous or uncertain skeletal indicators that might potentially support alternative, non-violent explanations for the observed skeletal damage. Let's talk about gender and participation patterns in documented ancient conflict evidence too, because this represents an interesting, closely related dimension worth exploring specifically. Researchers studying ancient conflict-related skeletal evidence have found that documented violent injury patterns sometimes show meaningful variation by gender and age, offering additional clues regarding the specific social organization and circumstances surrounding a given instance of ancient violence. Though researchers continue actively studying and refining understanding regarding exactly how consistently and how universally any specific gendered pattern actually applied across different ancient societies, time periods, and specific types of documented conflict and violence. Let's talk about how this broader historical and archaeological research connects to contemporary conflict prevention and peace studies research too, because this represents an important, practically relevant contemporary application worth exploring before wrapping up this broader discussion. Researchers studying contemporary conflict prevention and resolution frequently draw on this broader historical and archaeological understanding already explored extensively throughout this topic, recognizing that understanding the specific historical and social circumstances that have traditionally correlated with increased organized conflict risk, including resource scarcity, territorial disputes, and rapid social or economic transformation, can inform contemporary efforts specifically aimed at identifying and addressing similar risk factors before they potentially escalate into actual organized conflict within contemporary societies and contexts. Let's talk about how this research connects to broader questions regarding human social cooperation and its relationship to intergroup conflict too, because this represents an interesting, somewhat paradoxical dimension worth exploring specifically before this discussion concludes. Researchers studying both human cooperation and human conflict have noted an interesting, sometimes underappreciated connection between these two seemingly opposite behavioral tendencies, since organized warfare specifically requires considerable intragroup cooperation and coordination to successfully execute, suggesting the same underlying cognitive and social capabilities that enable remarkable human cooperative achievement within a given group may also, under certain specific circumstances, enable organized conflict directed against different, competing groups, representing a seriously complex, sometimes uncomfortable relationship between these two seemingly opposite but actually closely interconnected aspects of human social behavior and capability. Let's talk about how researchers specifically avoid overgeneralizing from limited archaeological evidence when studying this particular difficult topic too, because this represents an important methodological caution worth addressing directly before wrapping up this broader discussion. Given how relatively limited and geographically scattered the specific archaeological evidence for early organized warfare actually remains compared to the vast scope of early human history, and geography already explored extensively throughout other topics, responsible researchers generally exercise considerable caution regarding drawing sweeping universal conclusions from any single specific archaeological site or limited regional evidence, instead emphasizing the considerable variation and complexity likely present across different specific regions, time periods, and cultural circumstances, rather than presenting any single, simple, universal narrative regarding organized warfare's actual historical origin and development across all of human history and geography. Let's talk about how the scale and lethality of organized warfare has changed considerably throughout subsequent human history too, because this represents an important, closely related dimension worth exploring before wrapping up this broader discussion. As human societies developed increasingly sophisticated weapons technology, increasingly large and organized military structures, and increasingly complex political and economic systems, the specific scale and lethality of organized warfare generally increased considerably compared to whatever more limited forms of intergroup conflict likely characterized earlier periods of human history, connecting directly to broader questions already explored extensively in other discussions regarding how many total wars humans have actually fought throughout our species' recorded history. Let's talk briefly about documented examples of societies with historically minimal organized conflict too, because this represents a fitting, worthwhile final final consideration before this discussion concludes. Anthropologists have documented certain specific traditional societies maintaining relatively peaceful, low-conflict social organization over extended historical periods, offering an important counterbalance to any assumption that organized warfare represents some kind of universal, inevitable feature of human social organization, regardless of specific cultural or environmental circumstance. These documented peaceful societies, while certainly representing a minority pattern compared to the broader historical prevalence of organized conflict already explored extensively throughout this topic, offer valuable additional evidence supporting the broader conclusion that organized warfare's frequency and intensity depends considerably on specific social, environmental, and cultural circumstances, rather than representing some kind of fixed, unavoidable biological inevitability applying uniformly across every human society and historical period. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full, honest answer to when humans invented war turns out to resist any single, simple, definitively confirmed answer, reflecting real, ongoing scientific debate and interpretive challenge rather than a fully settled scientific conclusion. Some of the earliest confirmed archaeological evidence for organized group violence dates back roughly 10,000 years, though researchers continue actively debating whether organized warfare specifically developed alongside settled agriculture and increasing social complexity, or whether the underlying capacity and tendency toward organized intergroup violence likely extends considerably further back into our species' deeper evolutionary history, potentially predating modern humans, specifically given comparable documented behavior among our closest living primate relatives. So the next time this actually significant, sometimes uncomfortable topic comes up in conversation, it's worth appreciating that current scientific research doesn't actually support any single, simple, confidently definitive claim regarding exactly when or why humans first began engaging in organized warfare, since the actual evidence remains considerably more complex and considerably more actively debated than casual popular assumption often suggests, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something as significant and as historically consequential as organized warfare's actual origin remains this truly uncertain and actively debated among researchers who've dedicated considerable careful effort to studying this specific question, what does that suggest about how carefully we should generally approach confident popular claims regarding what supposedly represents fixed, unchangeable human nature, especially when the underlying scientific evidence turns out to be this seriously complicated and this far from any kind of simple, settled consensus?